Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the docu-series James Brown, Say It Loud. I'm joined today by director Deborah Riley Draper and producer Tariq Trotter, who you also know as Black Thought from The Roots. And in starting off with you, Deborah, I love that you kind of had this initial spark and idea of like the thesis for what you wanted this series to be when you were pitching yourself as a director, and that it all went back to Look magazine in 1969, which was posing the question, is James Brown the most important Black man in America? And I was interested in how the cover of that magazine really served as like the thesis and the jumping off point for figuring out the structure of how you envisioned telling this story.
Absolutely. I actually had never seen that cover until 2.5 years ago. And when I was doing my initial research to build the treatment, I ran across the cover. Is James Brown the most important Black man in America? And I thought, wow, that's pretty provocative. And it was especially provocative given that the year was 1969. They weren't asking the question about Dr. Martin Luther King. They weren't asking the question about Malcolm X. They were asking the question about James Brown. And I said, well, there it is right there. That's the thesis. That's the through line. Just how important was he to culture, socially, politically, musically, as a father, as a husband, as a businessman? And that's what we wanted to actually unpack. And that's what we wanted to excavate. And it was the perfect jumping off point to look at him across all 4 episodes. Was he the most important man growing up in South Carolina? Did he become the most important man on the Chitlin circuit? Did Say It Loud catapult him into the stratosphere of someone who was a culturally important figure, a change maker? And then from the end of the 90s into his death, how did his contributions impact Black thought, right? How did it impact hip hop? How did it impact us all? And how do you get to have a legacy that's 6 decades old? You got to be pretty important, right? So that's where it started, and that's what we dug into across the 4 episodes.
I love that. And Tariq, I see you nodding to so many of the points that Deborah is making there. And so I was really interested in, growing up and coming into the music industry as an artist yourself. What was that relationship that you had, and what were you excited to be able to try and help capture as a producer through this series for audiences to really see that relates to the way that you fell in love with James Brown's music?
For me, I was really interested in the opportunity to humanize Mr. Brown, in a different way, in a different way than any of the other stories that have already been told, which, there are many. Um, talk about importance and just his significance to the culture and to what it is that I do as an artist. The way we, I mean, he was a revolutionary in so many different ways, but one of the things that he revolutionized that was really impactful upon me and my generation was the way we understood and heard music. Because before he, sort of implemented his vision, we understood and heard music just in a different way. We weren't able to receive it in the way that we receive it now. And just in his sort of shift from, the two and the four, which was, recognized as what people call the backbeat, to the downbeat, which, was, music that, just hits immediately on the one. That's what hip hop and, before hip hop, that's what, funk music, and before funk music, soul music, were all born from. And so that all came from him. That's something that he revolutionized. So I'm just, thankful to be able to, be part of a project that is a continuum of that legacy. You know what I mean?
No, it's so great. And I love as well that the series kind of captures this aspect of, understanding America culturally, socially, politically is also understanding James Brown, and the two are so intertwined throughout the series. And so for both of you, wanted to ask just about creating this piece of artwork and this docu-series that really captures the ethos of the two being so hand in hand in the way you've told this story.
Mhm.
I love that you call it artwork. That's our approach to it, right? Like it is something that should stand, and it's something that should be evaluated and assessed as art. But in a lot of ways, it's the excavation of a Black man in the centering of his life that was critically important. Like Tariq says, humanizing Mr. Brown was a part of our journey. And in doing that, we really had to look at America, right? Because Mr. Brown's trauma, my trauma, all of our traumas come from how our country operates. So, from that segregated place that he lived in Augusta, Georgia, to all the places that he would visit, those things deposit into him and they also withdraw from him. And we needed to unpack a lot of that to understand why the music was so powerful, why the music was so soulful, and why audiences around the world responded to the lyrics in the way they did and responded to him, and why it was important to him to open radio stations, open restaurants, have the first private jet as a Black man, right? And have the James Brown trading stamps that you could buy food and bread with, like all of these things. He was this incredible mogul that had a seventh grade education. So that was really important to understand the background so that we could see the trajectory, so that we can be inspired by it and take from it.
Yeah, yeah.
Was that similar for you in terms of like the lens that you were viewing it through as well, Tariq?
Absolutely. I mean, you talk about someone with the seventh grade, education and the duality of, him, having his own schools essentially and, spearheading, programs to keep kids from dropping out of school. It just, it speaks to the complexity, of the man. And I mean, all of his music and lyrics were always about, discipline, ownership, agency, empowerment, and essentially independence, right? So he was the first artist to come out in popular music and talk about, getting yourself together. So he was able to normalize challenging the status quo. So it's something that I definitely appreciate, and the way that he was able to nuance his activism is an approach that I think I've applied throughout my career, and throughout we have as the Roots as a collective as well.
And I love as well, Deborah, that you were bringing up that point of how the series really works to humanize him. There's certain things that it touches upon that we've heard about in news stories, but every single aspect is how can we humanize this aspect of the story? One of my favorite moments is hearing his daughter talk about what it meant for him to bring her out on stage and to dance with her and to have that moment, because
Yeah.
I think that connects even outside of the scope of what that would be like to have a moment like that with your dad on stage in front of people. Everybody has their version of that. And so how did you set about at every point telling this story, which is telling the story of America and the broad scope of that, but then ultimately still always comes back to that touch point of the humanity of him as a person as well?
You know what? I think about my own dad in storytelling a lot. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but whenever we got to have those special moments, I know how critical and meaningful they were for me. Um, as a Black woman born and raised in the South, and thinking about how much my uncles and my dad and my mom and my aunt loved James Brown, they didn't love him just because of the music. They loved him for what he represented. He was liberation to them. He got to say things that I'm sure they would love to say that they couldn't. He got to do things that they only dreamed of. But through him, they all got their own ability to be self-sufficient, and they saw drive and they were able to apply that drive. And when I look at him, I see a dad, I see a Black man, I see a son. So I can't not see that. So I have to reflect that in the work. And spending time with his daughters, who are very lovely, their love for him and those moments were so touching. Every time I watch that episode, I cry when she says he pulls her out on the stage. It's the
Yeah,
most
yeah,
touching thing. And Yama and Deanna love him. And when Deanna tears up about that moment, it takes me out every time, because I know that kind of love, but also that kind of care and fear and admiration that you have for any Black man, right? Like, you want to protect them. You want to make sure that nothing happens to them. And you see that in her and you feel that in her.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I think it might be my favorite point of the whole series. And, for you, Tariq, in everything that you were describing about your relationship with him as an artist and everything with his music and how that had been so connected, how do you feel like that really shifted and evolved and grew from working with Deborah and being a part of this project in a way that you got to really connect with this inner side and kind of see the vulnerability and see the humanity even more so in him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just that. I think being able to, just understand the depth and dimension of a person, I think is something, especially of an artist, of a genius, of a legend, is something that it takes time. And for me, the process began when I, initially worked with, James Brown's family and the estate and Mick Jagger and lots of folks who were also involved in this project on the biopic, Get On Up. So I think that was sort of my first glimpse at, I interacted with I'm still friends with, his grandchildren, and then, just to see his impact, his generational, impact, the impact of his legacy, and how much of a family man he was. I was really moved, to see his impact, just the impact of his mentorship on Reverend Al Sharpton. That was really, that's something that was really moving to me throughout this process. And when we did the panel during our first premiere, I was almost moved to tears, seeing Reverend Al talk about Mr. Brown. And it was, Reverend Al's a tough dude. I've seen him in these hallways here at NBC, for over the past 15 years. And I've never seen him more vulnerable, and I've never seen him come off, at more human than in those moments when he's speaking about Mr. Brown and their relationship. So in that, I see myself, and I see, my relationships with the father figures that I've had, along my personal trajectory. So there's that. During the process, I realized, how many, similarities and parallels we sort of shared in our story, from the humble beginnings. And I was arrested when I was 12 years old. Just having to really do for self from very early on, was something that I could completely relate to.
Absolutely. And, Deborah, as well, in terms of the different participants that you have throughout the film speaking to camera, it's such a great cross section because it's people that are so connected and in so many different ways. And you kind of, something you're gonna get that's gonna really come into the film by having his daughters in the film, for example. But even just the fact that you thought to have the band members, and I feel like nobody ever talks to them, but they have such an intimate relationship with him, and they worked
Right.
with him for years and for decades, a lot of them. And so how did you make sure that you were having this real cross section of people that could speak to all the different facets and kind of like personality aspects and different parts of his life?
I wish I could say it was a science, but it was really around, wow, these would be interesting people to talk to because of, especially Martha High, to be a background singer for 4 decades to James Brown. That's a voice you want to hear what Miss Martha has to say. You want to learn from Fred Thomas. Not only is he an incredible musician, but he played on so many of those hits in the late 70s and the 60s, in the late 60s and 70s. So these are people who understood Mr. Brown not just as a band leader, but as a friend, as a boss, as a performer, but also someone they broke bread with. So they had an intimate relationship, and I wanted to really understand what that looked like. And they shared, and it was funny and it was poignant, but it was always respectful. And there were a lot of lessons that they all learned from Mr. Brown that they still hold on and cherish, and that speaks to the man himself.
It's so great. And Tariq as well, the series also talks very specifically about the influence of his music on other artists, and in particular, the fact that he created such a specific sound with funk that is such a direct influence to the hip hop world still to this day.
Absolutely.
And I was just interested in asking you a little bit more about kind of like your views and your thoughts on that relationship that his music still continues to have with so many artists within the hip hop community.
I mean, his music, I think, it continues to, the connection is something that is gonna last forever, because he is the original article, right? So in his case, like when we're talking about James Brown and his extended collective of musicians, that's it, like that's the funk from which it came, right? With the Gillick, if not for the courage of the fearless crew, the minnow would be lost. They're that crew, you know. So that's something that is inextractable from hip hop. Funk, hip hop, it's all derivative of that same movement, you know. So yeah, I'm just very, grateful and appreciative, to still in my lifetime be able to reach out and touch so many people who played such an integral role in that. It's been a blessing to have such a long career. I think we the roots has been the little engine that could.
I love that. And Deborah, in talking about the all of the different subjects that you cover, we follow his like rise to success, but it also covers hardships, obstacles, and some of the darker material of his life. And I think it does so in a way that, again, just goes back to that idea of humanity. It's, yes, there was violence and abuse in his household, but we also look at the way that it's a cycle of trauma that repeated from his childhood,
Yep.
and what that looks like generationally. And I also love the way that in speaking about that side of such a sensitive matter, that you do so through his daughters and through his family. So it's not something where it's second, third hand from other people. It's what was the direct experience? What was the emotional experience of this? What was your viewpoint from being in that household specifically? So everything is firsthand and not misconstrued or misrepresented. And was that something that was very specific to you early on, that it was always going to be primarily their voices telling that part of the story?
100%. I spent some time at the Morehouse School of Medicine learning about interpersonal violence. I was not even familiar with the term IPV, but in understanding how to talk to someone who survived any type of IPV incident, you have to do it in a specific way. So I learned to ensure that that interview would not leave harm, right? And not leave chaos when I leave. So I wanted to be able to ensure it was someone who had that direct experience, that when we did the interviews themselves, we cleared the room so I could have that conversation in a way that was private and in a way that was sensitive to their experience. So what you see on the screen is pure and unvarnished, but it was created in a way that that conversation would not harm anyone who participated in it, and hopefully anyone who watched it as well. So it was definitely done with, I went to the experts because I didn't want to mess up. So I definitely talked to some PhDs, as I said, at Morehouse School of Medicine, who specialize in IPV and Black trauma, to really help me understand how to humanize a conversation that's incredibly tough.
And for both of you as well, it's easy to think of James Brown at this point and to just think about the idea of success and the legacy that he's left behind. But also the series really looks at the cultural currency and kind of like the momentum. It's never equal footing the entire time for any artist's lifetime. There's moments where he has more of it, there's moments where it goes back down. And you see him kind of like gaining and losing it and regaining it. And I think the series really looks at, what does it take of you as an individual? What is the weight that takes? What is the responsibility? We see him later in his career performing on stage when he wasn't in the best of health, but that was
Yeah.
what he needed in order to kind of like have that cultural legacy at that point in his life. And so I just wanted to ask you both about, that aspect that you found quite interesting in exploring in his career and just looking at the different ebbs and flows, because it is so true to any artist's journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's part of what makes James Brown and his music and his legacy, so easy to connect to, right? That's part of what explains why it's a global phenomenon, right? And not, it's something that transcends, generation and cultures, and there are people who are racist, who don't believe in, they who don't support black music, or who would never listen to funk or soul or hip hop, who are still somehow James Brown fans. There are people who sort of make that exception, right? But I feel like his music is, in his energy, his power it is transcendent in that way. So as an artist, James Brown was he was fearless. Mr. Brown was fearless, and the level of courage and sacrifice that he was able to exhibit is, for me, like that's the bar, right? So that's, as an artist, as an individual, in terms of integrity, and agency, it always comes back to agency. Yeah, I feel like he was the chef's kiss.
Was that similar for you, Deborah, in your journey of exploring that side?
I think Tariq said it perfectly. I mean, it is about the agency. It's also about, in so many interviews in the archival footage that I was able to watch, he talked about never leaving the audience feeling like they, paid for something they didn't get. Like he
Oh, yeah,
always
showmanship. Wow.
wow, right? Like just plain wow. Like he is the bar. Like no one worked harder and no one cared more about the experience of people listening to the music and watching him perform. That was his love language to all of us, and to every audience member that's ever seen him or anyone that's ever listened. He did not want to disappoint, and he wanted to over deliver every single time.
Yeah, yeah.
I love that. And Deborah, in also talking about the archival material, I love the way that you didn't just take the archival material that seemed available, that you always just like dug that little bit deeper. And one of my favorite things was like when you were going through all the archival stuff with Universal Music Group, it wasn't just, oh, I'd love like the recordings of the music. It was, I want to listen to like the raw recordings. I want to find those moments where there's like chatter in the studio so I can get even more of just like a little bit of a semblance of who he was when he wasn't on stage or talking to camera. And I was interested in just that journey of looking at archival footage and then just finding those spaces where you could just go that one little layer deeper.
That actually was the most fun because we had access to the vault and we are like, okay, what's in there? Like, what can we have? What can we use to make it different? And every time we were able to hear something and we could hear him talking to the band or like Mr. Brown and Sid Nathan, my goodness, that whole interchange is crazy. So being able to hear these original audio recordings where they didn't know they were actually where it was still being recorded, that to me was gold because not only was it rarely heard, but it really was a glimpse into how he loved what he was doing and how he defended the honor of his music and how he defended musicianship and that everything was about this vision, like Tariq said, and being able to execute against that vision in the highest order, period. And whatever had to be sacrificed or whoever had to be sacrificed,
Yeah.
it,
So
it
be
was
it.
so be it. So be it. And I
Yeah.
was like, okay, all right. And nobody could tell. I wanted to, you see so much of him talking because I don't believe anybody can tell Mr. Brown's story better than Mr. Brown.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Mhm.
I love that. And Tariq as well. I wanted to talk about what you were touching upon earlier, which is, James Brown was this hugely successful musician in the business, and he had so many different business ventures on side of that. But he did only have a seventh grade education. And so he was
Yeah.
such an advocate for that as well. Even down to the story that Questlove tells on screen about Eddie Murphy meeting James Brown and him
Mhm.
advising him, like, buy a plot of land, bury a bunch of
Yeah.
money, the IRS will never, and that was his way of thinking about it. But I was interested for you in some of the spaces that you've really had people kind of like give you certain details or certain mentorship in like understanding the business side, because I feel like from the outside, everybody always talks about the artistry and the creativity. But at the end of the day, there's such a huge component of the business side that people just don't get the opportunity to know and learn about when they're coming up in the business.
Yeah, well, I think, stewardship and mentorship, is just super important. But no, people are less likely to offer, it to you, to offer you, guidance, assistance, stewardship, mentorship, community, unless you sort of you reach out as well. So it's a double-sided coin. So, and I think more so in recent years, I think, in my you know older adult life, I've learned not to hold back when I need help, you know. Um so yeah, I think there's that. I think there's value in, knowing when you sort of can't do it on your own, right? And for me, um I mean, I always talk about my saving grace having been the arts, right? That's sort of how I made it out of the mud. I experienced lots of trauma as a young person. Both my parents were murder victims. Again, just lots of, the same consequences that, had a young Mr. Brown, as independent as he was as a young person. So yeah, for me, there's always been value in just, the saving grace of the arts. And I feel like, Mr. Brown is the true embodiment of that. I had on a hat the other day that it just says art, just big. It's bigger. It's the ART is so big that it sort of sticks off the sides of the hat. And it's a baseball cap. And the company that makes that piece is called Art Comes First. And I think, Mr. Brown is the embodiment of that, of, the art coming first at all costs, no matter what, sacrifices he had to make to maintain that discipline.
I love that. And for both of you as well, the whole kind of ethos with James Brown of like say it loud and, take up the space that you should in the world and don't be afraid to do that is such a great one. And it's so resonant throughout the series. And
Yeah.
so for both of you, I was interested in how you feel like his music or your connectivity with him as an artist and the experience of making this docu-series has kind of like opened up your own relationship with that idea of saying things loud and taking up your space.
I think I'm transformed, forever transformed. I'm grateful to be able to have worked with Tariq and Questlove. And actually, Tariq and I worked together before 20 years earlier on New Classic Soul. This commercial campaign 20 years ago. So it was kind of nice to reconnect in this way. But what I learned was this idea of not playing small, right? Mr. Brown was not a small player. He took up the space, and his saying it loud is really a challenge. It's important for us not to be silent. It's important for us to say the things that need to be said and loud enough so that they penetrate and so that they stay with people, but also because people before us didn't get a chance to speak, they had to be silent because silence was the only way they were going to be able to live and survive. So now that we have an opportunity to use our voice, we have to use it and be powerful with all the platforms and be accountable and respectful for those opportunities. So I think I'm transformed by that notion, and I'm transformed by this idea of the discipline combined, with the authority and the agency. Those three things are quite powerful, and that's my personal lesson that I was able to extract from just watching and listening and just taking in Mr. Brown.
Yeah.
It is. And how about for you, Tariq?
I mean, Deborah said it all, you know. Um, I mean, for me, I could take it back to the foundation, you know. In terms of discipline and the example, that has been set through your word and deed. I mean, that's the seed from which the band The Roots actually came. Our like the foundation, like how Questlove and I initially even met and connected was over, a love for James Brown, a mutual, appreciation for Mr. Brown's music. His best friend in our high school, which is the High School for Creative and Performing Arts in Philly in the 80s, was Christian McBride, who would go on to become, one of the greatest, proponents of James Brown's legacy and, one of the greatest, bassmen in his own right, of all time. And so when we were all kids, that was our connection. We all bonded over, Christian's ability to play just like, Bootsy, and, Amir's ability to play funky drummer like Clyde Stubblefield. And, their ability as, I guess all of our ability as young people to understand the level of discipline that it would require to achieve a level of, mastery, to reach mastery. And I think it's something that, we all sort of came to understand at different points in our lives. But we've all eventually come to understand it. And I think we've all mastered that path that we began on at, 14 or 15 years old. And I think a lot of that is because, again, of the bar, and that bar as a musician, for musicianship, as a band mate, as a, for leadership. I mean, it all, could come back to Mr. James Brown and his work ethic.
It's so great. And I love all the details that you've both shared kind of
Oh yeah.
about his impact and his music. So
Of
thank you so much to both of you. I really, really appreciate it. And congratulations on the series.
Oh no,
Oh,
thank you.
thank
Thanks for
you.
having me.